Queen Elizabeth I is often remembered for her political shrewdness, her ability to navigate the complexities of power, and her remarkable leadership during one of England's most transformative eras. However, her influence extended far beyond the confines of the royal court and the battlefield. Elizabeth I was also a cultural visionary, an artist, patron, and muse whose reign ushered in a golden age of English creativity and innovation. Her reign not only saw the rise of iconic figures like Shakespeare and the flourishing of English theatre, but also an explosion in music, literature, and visual arts that would shape the nation's identity for centuries to come. Through her unparalleled mastery of self-representation, artistic patronage, and cultural diplomacy, Elizabeth I became not just a monarch, but a cultural architect, weaving together the threads of power, art, and national identity in ways that have continued to inspire generations. When Elizabeth I ascended the throne of England in 1558, she inherited a fractured and uncertain nation. Torn by decades of religious strife, power struggles, and foreign threats, England seemed an unlikely stage for a cultural golden age. Yet, over the course of her 45-year reign, Elizabeth transformed her court into a beacon of intellectual and artistic achievement. Her time as monarch, often referred to as the Elizabethan Age, came to symbolize a period of stability, national pride, and extraordinary creative energy. Central to this transformation was Elizabeth herself. Not merely as a ruler or a passive observer of cultural events, but as an active and deliberate architect of a new English identity forged through the arts. Her reign signaled a reawakening of artistic life in England, with the Queen positioned at its very heart. The reign of Elizabeth I, 1558 to 1603, stands out in history not only for its political success, but for its flourishing cultural achievements. She was the last Tudor monarch and the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, a birth that had been surrounded by scandal and marked by the shadow of illegitimacy. Yet, through intellect, political shrewdness, and sheer charisma, Elizabeth turned her perceived weaknesses into formidable strengths. She cultivated a new narrative around her monarchy, framing herself as a divinely ordained and unassailable ruler. In an age when many questioned the ability of a woman to govern, Elizabeth redefined queenship. She became the Virgin Queen, a figure of mythic stature who ruled without a husband, answering only to God and her people. This identity, deliberately shaped and continuously reinforced, became a cornerstone of the cultural revival that blossomed under her watch. It is no coincidence that the arts flourished during the reign of a queen. Elizabeth's very presence altered the dynamics of court life and the way power was imagined, portrayed, and performed. Artists, writers, musicians, and performers responded to the singular fact of her gender by crafting new symbols, styles, and stories that reflected both the marvel and complexity of a female sovereign. Courtly poetry, for instance, became a vehicle not only for praise but for negotiation. Writers like Edmund Spenser and Philip Sidney engaged in a sophisticated dance of homage and ambition, using their verse to flatter, critique, and seek favor. The court itself functioned as both a political center and a cultural engine, where art was not simply an ornament of rule, but a mechanism of it. Pageantry, drama, portraiture, and music were employed as instruments of authority, celebration, and spectacle. Elizabeth understood the power of art to shape perception and identity. She was not content to let others define her image. She actively controlled how she was seen, commissioning portraits that portrayed her as eternal, invincible, and ageless. In the famous Armada portrait, for example, she stands beside a globe, one hand resting upon it, while behind her, ships sink and flags fly. She appears as an empress of land and sea, untouched by time or threat. In reality, she was a monarch constantly under pressure. Yet through art, she was transfigured into a goddess of destiny. This conscious self-mythologizing was unprecedented in its scale and sophistication. Elizabeth became more than a queen. She became a symbol, a living icon whose image and legend echoed far beyond the court. Her reign coincided with the flowering of the English Renaissance, a movement that blended humanist learning with native traditions of poetry, music, and storytelling. Yet the Renaissance in England was unique, less tied to Catholic religious imagery and more grounded in secular, vernacular expression. Elizabethan culture embraced drama and poetry, celebrating wit, wordplay, and rhetorical mastery. The Queen's love of languages — she spoke Latin, French, Italian, and Greek — made her an ideal patron for such an environment. Under her rule, England produced some of its most enduring literary figures, including William Shakespeare, whose plays often explore themes of power, gender, and performance that resonate with the peculiar conditions of Elizabeth's monarchy. In many ways, the stage became a mirror for her reign, reflecting and reinterpreting the challenges and triumphs of a woman who governed a patriarchal world. Elizabeth's court became not only a seat of political power, but also a laboratory for artistic experimentation. Courtiers composed elaborate masques and dances to entertain and flatter the queen. Music filled the halls, with composers like William Byrd and Thomas Tallis crafting sublime harmonies that echoed the spiritual and ceremonial aspects of court life. Portraitists pushed the boundaries of representation, turning the queen into a mythic figure adorned with suns, serpents, rainbows, and pearls. Writers walked the fine line between praise and political commentary, wrapping their insights in allegory and metaphor. All of this activity contributed to a vibrant and distinctive culture that bore Elizabeth's stamp. It is essential to understand that Elizabeth's influence on the arts was not passive. She was a deliberate and calculating leader who used culture to advance her political agenda. She rewarded artists and playwrights, encouraged the dissemination of her image, and created rituals that reinforced her centrality in the nation's imagination. By embracing and guiding the arts, she extended her reach into every corner of English society. She made herself omnipresent, not just through military or economic might, but through stories, sounds, and images that portrayed her as the embodiment of England itself. When Elizabeth I ascended to the English throne in 1558, she did so not only as a monarch, but as one of the most educated women of her age. Her intellect, command of languages, and deep familiarity with classical thought were the products of a rigorous Renaissance education rooted in humanist ideals. Unlike many rulers before her, Elizabeth was not merely surrounded by scholars, she was one herself. Her education shaped her political philosophy, rhetorical mastery, and even the symbolic identity she crafted as the Virgin Queen. Elizabeth's education was deeply embedded in the intellectual traditions of the Renaissance, a cultural movement that sought to revive the classical knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome. Humanist scholars believed that moral character, political wisdom, and eloquence could be cultivated through the study of classical texts. For Elizabeth, born in 1533 to Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, the Renaissance curriculum provided more than intellectual refinement. It was a path to self-preservation and future sovereignty. As a royal daughter whose legitimacy was often questioned, education became both armor and weapon. She was taught a curriculum traditionally reserved for princes, not princesses. It included Latin and Greek, rhetoric, philosophy, history, mathematics, logic, theology, and classical literature. This education was grounded in the belief that fluency in ancient languages gave access to the finest moral and civic wisdom of the past. Elizabeth read Cicero, Seneca, Plato, Aristotle, and Virgil, mastering not just the language of these writers, but the intellectual frameworks they represented. By the time she was a teenager, Elizabeth could translate complex classical texts with elegance and insight. Elizabeth's education was supervised by some of the most respected scholars in Tudor England. Chief among them was Roger Ascham, a noted humanist and author of The Schoolmaster, a treatise on education that emphasized kindness, discipline, and the imitation of classical authors. Ascham's approach rejected rote memorization in favor of thoughtful engagement with language and argument. He described Elizabeth as an extraordinary pupil, diligent, curious, and quick to learn. In his words, she read more Greek before breakfast than many men would attempt in a day. Ascham instilled in her a love of learning and a deep respect for the written word. Under his guidance, Elizabeth developed fluency in Latin and Greek, as well as French and Italian. This multilingual capacity was not merely ornamental. It enabled her to engage directly with diplomatic correspondence, religious texts, and political philosophy in their original languages. She also received instruction from William Grindal, another humanist scholar, and later John Cheek and Richard Cox, who helped solidify her theological education during a time of fierce religious turmoil in England. What distinguished Elizabeth from many other educated nobles was not just her knowledge, but her ability to apply it strategically. She saw learning not as a passive accomplishment, but as an active means of governance, persuasion, and self-definition. Two thinkers who loomed large in Elizabeth's intellectual world were Desiderius Erasmus and Marcus Tullius Cicero. Erasmus, a leading Christian humanist of the early 16th century, emphasized the role of reason and ethics in religious life and education. His belief that the study of classical languages and moral philosophy could refine the soul resonated with Elizabeth's upbringing. Erasmus also promoted the ideal of a wise Christian ruler who governed with moderation, humility, and learning, a model that Elizabeth would consciously emulate throughout her reign. Cicero, the Roman statesman and orator, had perhaps the greatest influence on Elizabeth's rhetorical style and political thinking. Cicero's ideas about republican virtue, public duty, and the power of oratory provided Elizabeth with a framework for kingship, or queenship, that was both moral and persuasive. His writings on the responsibilities of leadership and the ethics of power became touchstones for her own public performances as monarch. Elizabeth adopted Cicero's belief in the necessity of eloquence in service to the state. Like Cicero, she viewed the spoken and written word as the foundation of civic life, and as a means to control public perception. It is no accident that Elizabeth's speeches, letters, and proclamations were so artfully composed. They were the products of a mind steeped in the techniques of classical rhetoric: ethos, credibility; pathos, emotional appeal; and logos, logical argument. Her education gave her the ability to sway parliament, manage diplomacy, and calm her people during times of war and plague. She knew when to appeal to duty, when to evoke divine favor, and when to present herself as a humble servant of the realm. In a world where many rulers still relied on intermediaries to write their letters, Elizabeth stood apart. She read and wrote voluminously, and with intention. Literacy for Elizabeth was not only a skill, but a form of power. Through her writings, she could shape political policy, respond to international events, and craft her image as monarch. She was also acutely aware of the symbolic power of texts. Her letters, both personal and political, often blended wit with wisdom, charm with steel. In one famous example, she wrote to Mary, Queen of Scots, combining flattery, legal argument, and veiled threat in a single page. When addressing Parliament or her troops, her speeches echoed with literary flair and historical allusion. The written word allowed her to extend her authority far beyond the palace walls. It was how she governed minds as well as bodies. Elizabeth also encouraged literacy and learning among her subjects. The expansion of the printing press during her reign, combined with royal patronage of learning, led to a flourishing of literature, translations, and educational texts. She helped foster an English literary tradition that would culminate in the works of Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Spenser. These cultural achievements were rooted, in no small part, in the values she had absorbed from her own humanist education. Elizabeth I was not simply a beneficiary of the Renaissance. She was one of its most brilliant embodiments. Her education, grounded in classical humanism and shaped by tutors like Roger Ascham, gave her the intellectual tools to navigate one of the most turbulent periods in English history. The influence of thinkers like Erasmus and Cicero informed her politics, her rhetoric, and her vision of monarchy. More than an adornment, her learning was central to her authority. As queen, she transformed the ideals of the Renaissance into instruments of rule, using language, literacy, and intellectual sophistication to assert power in a world that was unaccustomed to powerful women. The story of Elizabeth's education is thus the story of how knowledge became sovereignty, and how a scholar became a queen. Queen Elizabeth I reigned over England during one of the most culturally vibrant periods in its history. Known as the Elizabethan Age, this era witnessed a flowering of English literature, music, drama, and visual arts. Central to this cultural renaissance was Elizabeth herself, not merely as a figurehead, but as an active patron and inspiration. She nurtured the arts, commissioned grand works, and cultivated a court culture that fused politics with artistic expression. In doing so, Elizabeth wielded patronage not only as a mark of prestige, but as a tool of governance, diplomacy, and image-making. In Tudor England, patronage was both a tradition and a strategic necessity. The monarch's approval and financial support could transform the careers of poets, musicians, playwrights, and painters. More than mere indulgence, this patronage was a political statement. It showed power, taste, and ideological alignment. Elizabeth's court was structured around networks of favor and influence, and the arts became a central avenue through which loyalty and service were demonstrated and rewarded. Elizabeth understood this dynamic well. Her support for artists was deliberate, aimed at projecting royal authority, national unity, and Protestant values. By attaching the crown to artistic achievement, she both enhanced her personal prestige and strengthened the symbolic power of her rule. In an age of visual and performative culture, royal patronage was a form of cultural diplomacy, a way to signal political stability and inspire loyalty. Elizabeth did not only welcome art, she commissioned it. She encouraged courtiers and nobles to fund literary and artistic production in her name, thereby weaving herself into the very fabric of England's cultural output. The result was a golden age of creativity. Writers such as Edmund Spenser, Christopher Marlowe, William Shakespeare, and John Lyly crafted works that often celebrated the Queen or reflected the ideological values of her court. Spenser's The Faerie Queene, perhaps the most famous literary tribute to Elizabeth, presents her as Gloriana, the embodiment of virtue and majesty. This epic allegory wasn't just a compliment. It was a political act, reinforcing Elizabeth's image as a wise, powerful, and godly monarch. Playwrights like Shakespeare often set their plays in distant lands or historical periods to subtly explore contemporary politics while affirming the virtues of Elizabethan governance. Elizabeth was also a lover of music and dance. She maintained a royal chapel and musicians, supported composers such as William Byrd and Thomas Tallis, and frequently hosted performances. Court masques and entertainments became key elements of political life, blending theater, music, and allegory to celebrate the Queen and her reign. Portraiture under Elizabeth reached new symbolic heights. Artists such as Nicholas Hilliard and George Gower produced paintings that were less about realism and more about royal myth-making. One of the most iconic images of Elizabeth is the Armada portrait, 1588, painted to commemorate England's defeat of the Spanish Armada. In this portrait, Elizabeth stands resplendent before a window showing the storm-tossed Spanish fleet, a visual declaration of divine favor and national triumph. Her richly adorned gown, bejeweled with pearls, symbols of virginity and purity, and the positioning of her hand on a globe, suggesting imperial ambition, make the painting a masterpiece of political iconography. Every detail, from the celestial motifs to the sea imagery, constructs a narrative of strength, chastity, and destiny. Such portraits were widely copied and disseminated, reinforcing the Queen's image across the kingdom and abroad. They were not just personal mementos, they were propaganda, crafted to awe, inspire, and control. The Elizabethan court was a space where literary and artistic flattery could be richly rewarded. Writers and artists vied for attention and patronage by casting the Queen in divine or heroic roles. She was frequently compared to classical goddesses Minerva, Diana, biblical heroines, Deborah, Judith, and personifications of justice, wisdom, and virginity. Allegory was central to this tradition. Rather than addressing the Queen directly in crude praise, artists cloaked their compliments in metaphor and myth. This form of oblique homage allowed them to navigate the delicate boundaries of power and expression, honoring the monarch while showcasing their own wit and learning. Yet flattery was not merely sycophantic. In many cases, it functioned as a kind of political negotiation. By shaping the Queen's image through allegory, artists could subtly promote ideals, policies, or religious stances. Elizabeth, ever astute, recognized and encouraged this. She allowed herself to be mythologized, knowing that the exalted image projected by art could buttress her political authority. Elizabeth's reign witnessed the emergence of a mythologized monarchy, in which the Queen became more than a ruler, she became a symbol. Drawing on classical and literary traditions, Elizabeth was cast in a series of exalted roles. Astrea, the virgin goddess of justice, Gloriana, queen of the fairies in Spenser's The Faerie Queene, and Cynthia, the moon goddess representing chastity and eternal light. These identities did more than flatter. They allowed Elizabeth to transcend her gender in a patriarchal society. By becoming a mythic figure, she avoided being seen merely as a woman in power. Instead, she was rendered as timeless, unchanging, and semi-divine, a sovereign whose legitimacy came not from birth alone, but from fate, virtue, and cosmic order. The Queen's association with Astrea, in particular, was powerful. In ancient mythology, Astrea fled the earth in the Iron Age, and was prophesied to return during a golden era of justice. Elizabeth's identification with Astrea suggested that her reign marked this return, a new age of peace and righteousness. This narrative aligned with the Protestant idea of England as a chosen nation and Elizabeth as its moral compass. Elizabeth's portraits were not mere likenesses. They were carefully constructed images full of symbolism. She often wore elaborate gowns encrusted with jewels, embroidered with emblems like the Tudor rose, phoenix, or eyes and ears, and laden with meaning. Her virginity, famously proclaimed and politically useful, was symbolized through pearls, moons, and immaculate white fabrics. Rather than age gracefully in art, Elizabeth froze time. As she aged, her portraits increasingly depicted her with smooth, pale skin, youthful features, and exaggerated regality. This was not vanity, it was strategic. By controlling how she appeared in public imagery, she retained power in a world that might equate female aging with decline. Symbolic objects in her portraits, globes, books, swords, serpents, or suns, often communicated messages of wisdom, imperial ambition, or moral clarity. For example, in the rainbow portrait circa 1600, she is depicted with eyes and ears on her gown, signifying omnipresence, and holding a rainbow with the inscription non-signed Sol Iris, no rainbow without the sun, reinforcing her role as the source of national harmony. Elizabeth was not only concerned with static imagery, she understood the power of performance. Royal progresses, journeys across the countryside, court masks, and ceremonies were all occasions for image-making. These events were staged with theatrical precision, designed to display the Queen's magnificence and connect her with her people. Pageantry allowed Elizabeth to blend spectacle with message. When she entered London in 1559 before her coronation, she was greeted by elaborate tableaux and symbolic performances. She responded with humility and clever oratory, reinforcing her image as both divinely anointed and attentive to her subjects. At court, she choreographed interactions with her courtiers. The Queen remained the focal point in all rituals. Dances, gift-giving, and even the structure of her audience chamber were arranged to preserve her mystique. Elizabeth's visual self-representation was perhaps her greatest innovation. In an age of political instability, religious conflict, and foreign threats, she built a cohesive image of strength, virtue, and divine favor. Her portraits, ceremonies, and iconography were designed to maintain the illusion of continuity and control. Unlike other monarchs who delegated image-making to courtiers or artists, Elizabeth was personally invested. She approved portraits, rejected unauthorized likenesses, and sometimes even banned certain depictions. Her attention to detail was a form of propaganda, using every image, performance, and symbol to assert her supremacy and moral authority. She did not need to lead troops in armor or rule as a warrior queen like Boudica. Instead, Elizabeth ruled through symbolic power. Her virginity became a political virtue, her jewels a sign of God's favor, her speech a manifestation of divine wisdom. She was, in her own words, a mere woman, but one who governed like no other, through iconography, intellect, and illusion. The Elizabethan court was the epicenter of political power and cultural life in 16th century England. It was not confined to a single location but moved with Queen Elizabeth I, encompassing her various palaces such as Whitehall, Hampton Court, Greenwich, and Windsor Castle. The court comprised a diverse assembly, including nobles, advisors, ladies-in-waiting, servants, and artists, all serving the Queen and participating in the governance and cultural activities of the realm. Politically, the court was the nucleus of decision-making. The Privy Council, drawn from the court's ranks, advised the Queen on matters of state. However, Elizabeth often relied on individual consultations, maintaining control over her policies and decisions. The court structure allowed Elizabeth to balance various factions, rewarding loyalty and service with positions and favor. Socially, the court was a stage where status and influence were displayed and contested. Attendance at court was both an honor and a strategic opportunity, as proximity to the Queen could lead to patronage and advancement. The court's itinerant nature, with the Queen's progresses through the countryside, extended its influence, allowing Elizabeth to connect with her subjects and display royal magnificence. Courtiers played a pivotal role in shaping the cultural tastes of the Elizabethan era. They were not only political figures, but also patrons and participants in the arts. Many courtiers were accomplished poets, musicians, and dancers, contributing to the court's vibrant cultural life. Their tastes and preferences influenced artistic trends, as they commissioned works and supported artists who aligned with their aesthetic and political ideals. Artists, in turn, were integral to court life. They created works that celebrated the monarchy, reinforced political messages, and entertained the court. The reciprocal relationship between courtiers and artists fostered a dynamic cultural environment where innovation and tradition coexisted. The Queen's favor could elevate an artist's status, making court patronage highly sought after. The court's emphasis on education and refinement encouraged the production of sophisticated art and literature. Classical influences merged with contemporary themes, resulting in works that were both erudite and resonant with the political climate. This fusion of intellect and artistry became a hallmark of Elizabethan culture. The Elizabethan court was renowned for its elaborate entertainments, which served both as amusement and as expressions of political and cultural values. Pageants. These public spectacles often accompanied royal progresses and significant events. They featured allegorical representations, elaborate costumes, and theatrical performances that conveyed messages of loyalty, virtue, and national pride. Pageants reinforced the queen's image as a benevolent and powerful ruler, connecting her to classical and mythological figures. Masks. Masks were courtly entertainments combining music, dance, and drama. They were characterized by their ornate costumes and scenery, as well as their allegorical content. Masks often celebrated the queen's virtues and the harmony of her reign, serving as both entertainment and political commentary. Tournaments. Jousting tournaments were a popular form of courtly competition, showcasing martial skill and chivalric ideals. The Accession Day tilts, held annually on November 17th, were particularly significant. Courtiers donned elaborate armor and participated in jousts that honored the queen and demonstrated their loyalty and valor. These cultural competitions were not merely entertainment. They were opportunities for courtiers to display their talents, gain favor, and reinforce the social hierarchy. They also allowed the queen to project her authority and the splendor of her court to both domestic and foreign audiences. Queen Elizabeth I's personal tastes and preferences had a profound impact on the artistic output of her court. Her patronage and approval were crucial for artists seeking success and recognition. The queen favored works that celebrated her reign, emphasized her virtues, and aligned with the political and religious ethos of her government. Elizabeth's preference for allegory and symbolism influenced the content and style of courtly art and literature. Artists and writers often employed classical references and mythological themes to flatter the queen and convey political messages. This approach not only pleased the queen, but also elevated the sophistication of the works produced. The queen's taste for music and dance also shaped the court's cultural life. She was an accomplished musician and dancer, and her enthusiasm for these arts encouraged their development and prominence at court. Composers and performers who catered to her preferences found favor and patronage, leading to a flourishing of musical innovation. Moreover, Elizabeth's image as the Virgin Queen inspired a wealth of artistic representations that emphasized purity, wisdom, and divine right. Portraits, poems, and performances often depicted her as goddesses or virtuous heroines, reinforcing her authority and the sanctity of her rule. During the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, poetry flourished like never before in England, and much of this literary blossoming can be directly attributed to the unique figure who sat on the throne. The Queen's presence at the center of political, cultural, and aesthetic life inspired a new wave of poetic expression. Her court was not only the seat of power but also the center of intellectual and artistic refinement, where poetry played a crucial role in reflecting the ideals and contradictions of the Elizabethan world. It was within this environment that courtly poetry developed into a highly stylized form, shaped by the expectations of royal patronage, the rhetorical traditions of humanism, and the complexities of power dynamics between genders. Elizabeth's unmarried status and the cultivated image of the Virgin Queen created an ideal figure for poetic idealization. Poets of her court and beyond, many of them her courtiers, turned to the queen not only as a sovereign but as a muse. She was the subject of love poems, odes, and elaborate allegories, where expressions of devotion blurred the lines between political loyalty and amorous admiration. Courtly poetry during this period was not merely an artistic pursuit, but a political tool. To write verses in praise of the queen was to participate in a performance of allegiance, flattery, and cultural sophistication. This literary climate produced some of the most enduring figures in English poetry, including Edmund Spenser and Sir Philip Sidney. Both exemplified the fusion of Renaissance ideals with Elizabethan courtly expectations. Spenser, best known for The Faerie Queene, crafted a vast allegorical epic in which Elizabeth herself appeared in various guises. As Gloriana, the Faerie Queen who symbolizes glory, as Britomart, the female knight who represents chastity, and as Belphoebe, a figure of virginity and strength. Through these characters, Spenser projected Elizabeth's virtues and crafted a poetic mythology around her sovereignty. The work was presented to the queen with the clear intention of securing favor, but it also reflects the broader literary transformation happening under her reign, where the monarch became both patron and poetic subject. Sidney, meanwhile, wrote Astrophil and Stella, a sonnet sequence deeply indebted to the Petrarchan tradition. In it, Sidney explored the tensions between idealized love and human desire. Though not addressed directly to Elizabeth, Sidney's sonnets echoed the court's preoccupation with unattainable love and stylized emotion. The Petrarchan influence, imported from Italy and refined by English poets, lent a framework of emotional expression, rhetorical elegance, and paradox to Elizabethan poetry. Poets would often cast themselves as suffering lovers, addressing an idealized woman who was noble, distant, and unattainable. In the court of Elizabeth, these poetic conventions took on new meaning. The real woman who stood at the center of this dynamic was not an abstract ideal, but a flesh-and-blood monarch who wielded enormous political authority. Elizabethan poetry thus found itself negotiating a delicate balance between homage and eroticism, loyalty and desire, symbolism and reality. Writing love poems to a queen was a nuanced act. It required adhering to a complex set of cultural codes that allowed expression without overstepping bounds. Many poets employed the trope of courtly love not only to praise Elizabeth, but to elevate themselves within court hierarchy. In doing so, they helped establish a genre, poetry addressed to the queen. This form became a staple of Elizabethan literary life, characterized by elaborate metaphors, classical references, and the elevation of Elizabeth as an embodiment of divine and feminine perfection. However, the presence of women in Elizabethan poetry was not limited to the queen herself. While the literary scene was dominated by men, the feminine played a central role in poetic form and content. Women were the objects of longing, symbols of virtue, and figures of mystery. But they were also increasingly recognized, albeit subtly, as interpreters of poetry and even contributors to its form. The rise of the printing press and expanding literacy among noblewomen allowed for greater engagement with literary culture, and while few women published under their own names, their influence as readers, patrons, and even authors was growing. The female gaze in Elizabethan poetry remains an underexplored but significant theme. Though much of the literature of the period was shaped by male perspectives, the unique position of Elizabeth as a female monarch created new possibilities. She was not only the object of the poetic gaze, but also a subject who read, responded to, and occasionally even composed poetry. The performative nature of her queenship, where she navigated expectations of femininity while asserting masculine authority, reshaped poetic conventions. In a court dominated by elaborate ceremony and aesthetic display, poetry became a space where gender roles could be performed, subverted, or idealized. Elizabeth's engagement with poetry was far from passive. She was known to appreciate and reward eloquence and literary wit. Her own verses, such as On Monsieur's Departure, reveal a depth of introspection and a command of poetic form. In these rare but notable instances, the Queen herself became part of the poetic tradition, not merely as a symbol but as a voice. Her participation, however limited, contributed to the reshaping of English verse to accommodate a uniquely feminine and sovereign presence. Moreover, the poetic dialogues that flourished under her reign, between poet and monarch, man and woman, subject and sovereign, added layers of complexity to Elizabethan verse. The intersection of gender, power, and artistry gave rise to a body of work that was as politically charged as it was aesthetically rich. Poetry became a language of negotiation, where meanings shifted according to the speaker's intent and the Queen's interpretation. Allegories could be flattering or cautionary. Sonnets could express love, loyalty, or ambition. In every case, the presence of Elizabeth transformed the function and reception of poetic language. The reign of Elizabeth I was a golden age for English poetry, shaped not only by the talents of its writers, but by the cultural climate cultivated at her court. The rise of courtly poetry, deeply entwined with the Petrarchan tradition and classical rhetoric, found fertile ground under a queen whose very identity invited poetic exaltation. Figures like Spenser and Sidney helped define the era's literary voice, but it was Elizabeth's unique role, as monarch, muse, and sometimes author, that gave Elizabethan poetry its distinctive character. The feminine, once confined to passive roles in verse, emerged as an active force, reflected in the Queen's image, voice, and power. Thus, the female gaze in Elizabethan poetry, shaped and embodied by Elizabeth herself, redefined poetic expression for generations to come. When Edmund Spenser published The Faerie Queene in 1590, he was not merely crafting a literary epic. He was building a monument to Queen Elizabeth I and contributing to the ideological foundation of her reign. The poem, structured as an allegory rich in symbolism and Renaissance virtue, celebrated Elizabeth not just as a monarch, but as a mythic figure, Gloriana. In doing so, Spenser solidified her place in England's poetic imagination and furthered the cultural movement that elevated her sovereignty into something sacred and heroic. The Faerie Queene exemplified how literature could serve political power, reflect moral ideals, and forge a sense of national identity. At the center of the poem lies Gloriana, the titular Faerie Queene, a radiant and powerful figure representing Queen Elizabeth. Although she is not the central actor in most of the narrative episodes, Gloriana's presence pervades the entire epic. She is the ruler of the fairy land, the one to whom knights pledge their allegiance and for whom they embark on quests. Her character blends several classical and Christian virtues: wisdom, justice, chastity, and magnificence, all traits that Elizabeth sought to embody in both public life and personal myth-making. Spenser uses this idealized version of Elizabeth to frame her as a ruler of divine right and moral perfection, reinforcing the cult of personality that surrounded the queen. Spenser's treatment of Gloriana reflects the complex ways Elizabeth I's reign fused female identity with sovereign authority. At a time when monarchs were expected to wield power with traditionally masculine attributes, military strength, rational judgment, and political command, Elizabeth walked a delicate line. She cultivated an image of herself as a prince in a petticoat, someone whose authority was not diminished by her sex but enhanced by it. The Faerie Queene echoed and reinforced this political balancing act by presenting female virtue not as passive or ornamental, but as active, moral, and often superior to male strength. Characters like Britomart, the female knight representing chastity, challenge conventional gender roles by demonstrating valor, intelligence, and independence in service of moral ideals. Britomart's journey to fulfill her destiny by uniting with Artegall, a symbol of justice, is deeply allegorical of England's desire for balance between moral governance and legitimate authority, embodied by the Queen herself. The poem also played a significant role in shaping and spreading what is known as the Tudor myth. This idea held that the Tudor dynasty had restored peace, divine order, and national glory after a long period of civil strife and instability. In The Faerie Queene, Spenser does not merely praise Elizabeth for her individual virtues. He places her within a grand historical and mythic tradition that stretches from King Arthur to the present. The Arthurian motif that runs through the poem connects Elizabeth's reign to a chivalric past filled with heroic deeds and moral clarity. By aligning her with these legendary figures, Spenser asserts that Elizabeth is the rightful heir to Britain's mythic greatness. She is not just a ruler of the present, but a culmination of the nation's divine destiny. This literary celebration was not purely symbolic, it served a direct political function. The 1590s were a period of religious tension, foreign threats, especially from Catholic Spain, and domestic uncertainty about succession. Against this backdrop, the Faerie Queene provided a vision of moral and political order under Elizabeth's rule. The poem's knights, each representing a particular virtue: holiness, temperance, chastity, friendship, justice, and courtesy, struggle against various allegorical threats such as pride, lust, and falsehood. These moral battles reflect England's own cultural and religious conflicts. The triumphs of these virtues under Gloriana's reign affirm the Queen's role as a stabilizing and sanctifying force in a time of upheaval. Through Spenser's lens, Elizabeth is not merely a sovereign by bloodline. She is a moral leader ordained by Providence. The Faerie Queene also contributed to the development of a collective national identity. At a time when England was still emerging as a unified Protestant power on the European stage, Spenser's epic helped construct a narrative of English exceptionalism. The poem, composed in richly ornate Spenserian stanzas, invoked classical epics like Virgil's Aeneid and Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, but reshaped their ideals into a distinctly English mold. Spenser deliberately wrote in English rather than Latin, aligning himself with the Protestant ethos of accessibility and national pride. His language, archaic and majestic, imbued the English vernacular with poetic gravitas, helping to elevate the status of English literature itself. The story thus became a cultural artifact of English identity, rooted in virtue, resistant to foreign corruption, and guided by a queen of nearly divine stature. Moreover, Spenser's presentation of Elizabeth through allegory allowed multiple layers of interpretation. For the learned courtier, the poem was a sophisticated political treatise wrapped in classical form. For the common reader, it was an adventure tale of knights and quests. For the Queen herself, it was a dazzling tribute that honored her rule, while also subtly advising and idealizing it. Spencer was aware of the risks and responsibilities of writing for a monarch. His praise had to be extravagant but plausible, idealized but rooted in recognizable virtues. By turning Elizabeth into Gloriana, he created a figure so laden with meaning that she could symbolize nearly anything: national glory, divine right, chaste femininity, or political prudence. While the Fairy Queen was ultimately unfinished, Spencer had originally planned 12 books, each focusing on a different moral virtue. The existing 6 books were enough to leave a deep imprint on English literature and the cultural perception of Elizabeth. The Queen reportedly appreciated the tribute, though she never granted Spencer the full rewards he had hoped for. Still, he received a modest pension and a place in literary history as the poet who most successfully translated Elizabeth's political persona into epic form. In retrospect, The Fairy Queen can be seen as a work of cultural synthesis. It merged Renaissance humanism with medieval romance, Christian morality with classical form, and poetic imagination with political propaganda. More importantly, it cast a woman, a real ruling monarch, at the center of a heroic myth. Through Gloriana, Elizabeth became larger than life, a symbol of virtue and power who could unite a kingdom under a shared poetic vision. The cult of Gloriana, nurtured by Spencer's pen, would long outlive both poet and queen, influencing not just literature, but the very way the Elizabethan era defined sovereignty, femininity, and national pride. Queen Elizabeth I was not only a commanding political figure, but also a formidable writer, whose literary output encompassed a wide array of forms, from state speeches and intimate letters to reflective poetry. Her writings, though fewer in volume than those of her male contemporaries, are marked by clarity, rhetorical sophistication, and a deliberate shaping of her public image. They provide a compelling window into her thoughts on power, duty, identity, and the burdens of queenship. Through her own hand, Elizabeth crafted language as a political tool, navigating the expectations of monarchy, the limitations of gender, and the challenges of governance with remarkable eloquence and control. Her speeches, in particular, stand as enduring examples of persuasive rhetoric and political theater. One of the most iconic, the speech delivered to her troops at Tilbury in 1588, is a masterclass in performative leadership. As England faced the threat of the Spanish Armada, Elizabeth presented herself not only as a queen but as a warrior leader, famously declaring, "I know I have the body but of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." In this moment, she harnessed the very tension between her female body and sovereign authority to strengthen her claim to power. Rather than deny her femininity, she acknowledged it, and then transcended it by invoking the martial and masculine resolve expected of a monarch. The rhetorical balance she struck in this speech is extraordinary. By embracing her gender, she made her leadership appear even more extraordinary, reinforcing the idea that her reign was an act of divine exception. Her speeches to Parliament and foreign envoys further underscore her command of language as a tool of diplomacy and authority. In addressing Parliament, she often used deferential language while subtly asserting her autonomy. For example, in her 1566 speech rejecting the demands that she marry, she framed her choice not as personal defiance, but as concern for her kingdom's stability. She stated that she was already married to the realm of England, casting herself as a bride of the state, a metaphor that blended personal sacrifice with political purpose. Such carefully constructed phrases show how Elizabeth transformed personal decision-making into an act of national service, presenting herself as a ruler whose will was guided by duty, not whim. Beyond speeches, her private letters reveal a more intimate, yet equally calculated use of language. Corresponding with figures such as Mary, Queen of Scots, and the French and Spanish courts, Elizabeth managed delicate political situations through her written words. Her tone could range from warm and conciliatory to cold and commanding, depending on the strategic needs of the moment. In her letters to Mary, for instance, Elizabeth frequently invoked the language of sisterhood and shared queenship, all while maintaining a tone of superiority and skepticism. Her ability to write with layered meanings allowed her to project both diplomacy and dominance, often without committing herself to a definitive course of action. In addition to political correspondence and speeches, Elizabeth also wrote poetry, much of which reflects her inner life as a monarch and a woman. These poems often deal with themes of love, loss, loneliness, and the burden of power. One of her most poignant works, When I Was Fair and Young, is a lyrical meditation on aging, beauty, and regret. In this poem, Elizabeth reflects on the suitors she once rejected and the fleeting nature of youth and desirability. Though framed as a personal confession, the poem also resonates with broader questions about identity and impermanence, particularly for a queen who built her public image on the idea of eternal virginity and incorruptible beauty. Another notable poem, The Doubt of Future Foes, delves into the political anxieties and threats that haunted her reign. Here, she portrays herself as a vigilant and embattled ruler, surrounded by enemies and betrayal. The poem combines a sense of personal paranoia with political resolve, revealing how deeply entwined her poetic voice was with her role as sovereign. The choice of meter and diction in this poem reflects the influence of courtly and Renaissance styles, but the content is rooted in Elizabeth's lived experience of power and its precariousness. What makes Elizabeth's writings particularly significant is how they model a form of political authorship rarely granted to women in her time. In an era when female voices were often silenced or dismissed, she not only spoke but did so with intellectual force and stylistic grace. Her command of Latin, Greek, French, and Italian gave her access to classical and continental literature, which informed her rhetorical strategies and enriched her vocabulary. Her education under tutors like Roger Ascham cultivated a style that was precise, persuasive, and often rich with classical allusions. Whether invoking Roman models of virtuous leadership or Christian ideals of humility, Elizabeth adapted these frameworks to fit her unique position as a female monarch. Moreover, her writings served as models of statecraft. They were carefully crafted to project stability, legitimacy, and moral authority. Every word was measured, every phrase shaped to convey not just a message but an image of herself, of her reign, and of England under her rule. Even when she expressed emotion or vulnerability, it was often with an awareness of audience and consequence. Her texts were never merely private, they were instruments of governance, part of the broader machinery that sustained her monarchy. Elizabeth's literary voice also helped establish the tone of her court and the wider cultural environment of the Elizabethan era. Her own engagement with writing elevated its prestige among courtiers and set a standard for intellectual accomplishment. Poets, scholars, and statesmen alike sought to emulate her style and align their work with her image. This dynamic helped shape the flourishing of English literature during her reign, creating a climate where eloquence and poetic expression were not only admired but politically consequential. Queen Elizabeth I's writings, whether speeches, letters, or poems, offer a rich and multifaceted insight into her reign and character. They reveal a sovereign deeply conscious of the power of words and adept at using language to navigate the complex terrain of politics, gender, and public perception. Her rhetorical brilliance allowed her to assert authority while maintaining an image of humility and grace. Her poetry exposed the personal dimensions of rule, while her official communications reinforced her command over state and self. Through her own pen, Elizabeth crafted not just policy but posterity, ensuring that her voice would resonate far beyond the walls of her court. The reign of Queen Elizabeth I marked a pivotal moment in the evolution of women's literary expression in England. As a powerful female sovereign who herself engaged in writing, Elizabeth's presence on the throne had a profound ripple effect on women of her age, particularly noble women who found inspiration and courage in her example. Her reign did not dismantle the deeply ingrained patriarchal structures of society, but it did allow a glimmer of possibility for educated women to assert themselves intellectually and artistically. This period witnessed the gradual emergence of women writers who navigated social limitations and began to leave their own marks on the literary landscape. Mary Sidney, Countess of Pembroke, stands as one of the most prominent figures among these pioneering women. A sister to the celebrated poet Sir Philip Sidney, she was herself a gifted writer, translator, and patron of the arts. Mary Sidney's achievements were exceptional, not only because of the quality of her work, but because she operated within the narrow confines of what was deemed acceptable for women in a male-dominated literary culture. Her translations of psalms into English verse were both devotional and poetic, and they served as a means for her to demonstrate her mastery of form and religious scholarship. At a time when theological and literary authority was largely male, Sidney's efforts offered a significant, though careful, intervention. She also completed and refined her brother's work, preserving and extending his literary legacy in a way that subtly asserted her own voice. For women like Sidney, authorship was fraught with social risk. The act of writing, particularly for public consumption, was still largely viewed as inappropriate for women, who were expected to remain modest, silent, and domestic. Education for noble women often included reading and some writing, but it was usually framed as a virtue for private moral development rather than public articulation. Consequently, when women did write, they often cloaked their work in humility, disclaimers, or religious justification. Prefaces and dedications were filled with apologies for daring to speak, claims of unworthiness, and assertions that their writing was meant solely for personal reflection or divine praise. These rhetorical strategies served as armor, protecting female writers from accusations of pride or impropriety. Despite these barriers, the presence of a ruling queen subtly altered perceptions of what women might be capable of intellectually. Elizabeth herself was a master of rhetoric, fluent in multiple languages, and publicly admired for her learning and eloquence. Her visibility as a scholar and stateswoman created a cultural context in which women's intellectual pursuits could be admired, if not entirely normalized. Her example empowered noble women, in particular, to embrace learning and engage in literary production. The Queen's court became not only a center of political power, but also a site of cultural legitimacy, where women of status could engage with poets, scholars, and artists without the same stigma they might face elsewhere. Female literacy grew during Elizabeth's reign, partly as a result of broader humanist educational reforms that emphasized classical learning and moral instruction. While such education was still skewed heavily toward men, a growing number of noble and upper-class families began to educate their daughters more seriously. Girls learned Latin, studied scripture, and practiced composition, often under the guidance of private tutors. This increase in literacy did not immediately produce a wave of published women authors, but it laid the groundwork for a more literate and expressive female class that would grow in confidence and influence in the generations to follow. With literacy came the possibility of patronage, and here too women began to take on more active roles. Just as Elizabeth's patronage of the arts helped shape the literary identity of her reign, other noble women began to sponsor poets, musicians, and artists. Patronage allowed women to exert cultural influence without directly confronting the restrictions of authorship. By aligning themselves with artistic achievement, women patrons could participate in the literary world while remaining within the bounds of social acceptability. The act of commissioning or supporting works offered a form of indirect authorship, a way of shaping taste and discourse without writing a single word themselves. Nevertheless, some women went further, pushing against the limits of what was permissible and entering the literary arena with courage and conviction. Writers such as Emilia Lanier, who would come into her own in the early 17th century, represent the flowering of seeds planted during Elizabeth's time. Though Lanier's major work, Salve Deus Rex Judaeorum, was published in 1611, its spirit was deeply indebted to the intellectual and cultural climate established under Elizabeth. Lanier, like Sidney before her, framed her writing in religious terms, but used her verse to argue for women's moral and intellectual worth. Her poetry included bold assertions of gender equality, challenging prevailing narratives of female inferiority. The shift in women's literary participation was also facilitated by the circulation of manuscripts in private and semi-private networks. Many women wrote for personal or familial audiences, sharing their poems and reflections in letters or among trusted friends. These manuscripts often served dual purposes: expressions of individual emotion and intellect, and instruments of social bonding or political alliance. In this way, female authorship could be discreet, but still meaningful, preserving dignity while asserting presence. Even in its more private forms, women's writing during Elizabeth's reign reflected an awareness of their marginal status and a desire to speak within or against that condition. The influence of the Queen, an unmarried, learned, powerful woman who ruled over a patriarchal society, was inescapable. Elizabeth's own life embodied a tension between tradition and transgression that resonated with many female writers. She showed that femininity and authority were not mutually exclusive, that a woman could be both eloquent and commanding. Her example did not erase the cultural suspicion of women's voices, but it did complicate and destabilize it. The Elizabethan era witnessed the quiet emergence of women writers who, inspired by the Queen and armed with increasing literacy and education, began to claim intellectual space in a world that had long denied them entry. Whether through translations, devotional works, poetry, or patronage, these women found ways to express themselves within the constraints of their gender roles. They carved out a place for female intellect and creativity, opening pathways that would be further explored in the centuries to come. Their contributions, though often overshadowed by their male counterparts, reflect a crucial moment in the history of women's writing, a moment made possible in part by the presence of a woman on the throne. William Shakespeare's career flourished under the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, a period often referred to as the English Renaissance or the Elizabethan era. This was a time of cultural efflorescence, and the theatre stood at the center of this artistic bloom. The presence of a female monarch at the helm of the English state shaped not only the political contours of the age, but also its cultural production. The influence of Queen Elizabeth I can be traced throughout Shakespeare's plays, both in overt homage and in the subtle infusion of gendered themes that reflect the complexities of female rule. As a playwright deeply attuned to the mood and dynamics of his society, Shakespeare navigated the cultural politics of the feminized monarchy with both sensitivity and strategic ambiguity. Shakespeare's career aligned closely with the last decades of Elizabeth's rule. His earliest works emerged in the 1590s, a time when Elizabeth was an aging but still commanding presence in English politics. Although she never married and famously styled herself as the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth presented a carefully constructed image of authority that defied conventional expectations of women in power. Her unmarried status and rhetoric of divine right allowed her to adopt masculine attributes of kingship while retaining a distinctly feminine aura. This duality offered fertile ground for a dramatist like Shakespeare, who consistently explored themes of identity, disguise, power, and gender throughout his works. One of the most striking aspects of Shakespeare's plays is the complexity and strength of his female characters. In a theatrical world where women were not allowed to perform and all female roles were played by men or boys, Shakespeare still managed to write women who were intellectually rich, emotionally complex, and frequently central to the dramatic action. Characters like Portia in The Merchant of Venice, Rosalind in As You Like It, Viola in Twelfth Night, and Lady Macbeth in Macbeth are not mere accessories to male protagonists. They drive the plots, challenge conventions, and often articulate some of the most profound reflections in the plays. In creating such figures, Shakespeare may have been responding to the political reality of a powerful queen. His women are often articulate, strategic, and capable of commanding attention, qualities Elizabeth herself demonstrated repeatedly in both domestic governance and foreign policy. Yet the plays do not simply celebrate feminine power, they complicate and interrogate it. Many of his female characters achieve agency only by temporarily assuming male identity or by operating within highly coded social frameworks. This recurring motif reflects the tensions inherent in Elizabeth's reign, between the exceptional nature of her authority and the patriarchal structure that continued to dominate English society. Nowhere is this exploration of gender more vivid than in Twelfth Night and A Midsummer Night's Dream, two plays that revel in disguise, confusion, and the fluid boundaries of identity. In Twelfth Night, Viola's decision to dress as a man and assume the identity of Cesario allows her to navigate a male-dominated world with remarkable freedom. Her disguise facilitates the complex romantic entanglements that drive the plot, but it also raises deeper questions about gender roles and the nature of attraction. The audience, fully aware of Viola's true identity, watches as other characters fall in love with her male persona, creating a layered commentary on desire and perception. In the context of a female-ruled nation, this theatrical gender fluidity takes on political resonance. Viola's ability to maneuver through social constraints while disguised as a man echoes Elizabeth's own strategy of adopting male-coded authority, calling herself prince and ruling with a firmness often associated with kings. Just as Viola must suppress her true identity to operate freely, Elizabeth often presented herself in ways that masked or neutralized her femininity. Shakespeare, then, was not only dramatizing gender play for comic or romantic effect. He was also, perhaps subtly, reflecting on the Queen's negotiation of gender and power. A Midsummer Night's Dream offers another rich example of Shakespeare's engagement with the feminine in relation to sovereignty and order. The play opens with a world on the brink of chaos, romantic disorder, parental authority challenged, and the magical realm in turmoil. At the heart of this instability is a power struggle between Titania and Oberon, the fairy queen and king. Titania's initial resistance to Oberon's demands shows her as a figure of authority and independence, unwilling to be subdued. Her eventual submission, brought about by enchantment, resolves the conflict but also raises questions about the dynamics of power between genders. Elizabeth's own image was carefully crafted to suggest both dominion and harmony. She was often portrayed in portraits and public pageantry as a goddess, a fairy queen, or a mythic ruler. Figures echoed in Titania and other female archetypes within Shakespeare's plays. The dreamlike quality of A Midsummer Night's Dream, where illusions govern reality and transformations blur identities, parallels the performative nature of Elizabeth's rule. Her authority was real, but it was also constructed and theatrical, dependent on symbolism, ritual, and spectacle. Shakespeare's fairy realm, ruled by a queen and filled with misdirection and enchantment, may be read as a playful but pointed reflection of court life and its artful manipulations. Shakespeare's plays also contain moments of direct or indirect commentary on Elizabeth herself. While censorship and courtly caution prevented open political critique or praise, writers found ways to engage with the monarchy through allegory, flattery, or allusion. In Henry VIII, co-written later with John Fletcher, Queen Catherine's dignity and eloquence in her downfall evoke sympathy and strength, perhaps inviting comparisons to Elizabeth's own mother, Anne Boleyn, or to Elizabeth herself. In Richard II, the deposition scene, with its meditations on kingship and the fragility of power, may have resonated uneasily in a realm ruled by a childless, aging queen. Some scholars have argued that Elizabethan audiences would have recognized in these scenes subtle nods to contemporary politics. The very act of dramatizing royal authority, even in historical or foreign contexts, was a way of engaging with the unique political situation of the day. Shakespeare's queens like Cleopatra, Lady Macbeth, or Queen Margaret offer a kaleidoscope of female power, some virtuous, some villainous, all compelling. Through them, Shakespeare wrestled with the contradictions of a world where a woman could command a kingdom, but still lived in a culture that prized male authority. The feminized monarchy of Elizabeth I's England thus provided a rich and complex backdrop for Shakespeare's dramatic imagination. His female characters, his use of disguise and transformation, and his nuanced reflections on power and identity all suggest a keen awareness of the cultural shifts engendered by a woman on the throne. While he never explicitly named Elizabeth in his works, her presence lingers throughout. Ghost-like in the eloquence of his heroines, the ambiguity of his disguises, and the theatrical splendor of his imagined courts. In responding to and reshaping the gendered politics of his time, Shakespeare not only entertained his audience, but also contributed to the ongoing dialogue about femininity, authority, and representation that the reign of Elizabeth I so powerfully inspired. The Elizabethan era saw the evolution of public theater as a dominant cultural force, influencing not only entertainment, but also the political and social fabric of England. Theater became a crucial tool for both the monarchy and the people, serving as a medium for expressing political ideas, shaping public opinion, and even addressing the complexities of state power. Queen Elizabeth I, as both monarch and cultural patron, had a complex relationship with the theater, recognizing its potential for political influence while simultaneously maintaining a firm grip on censorship and control over the messages being conveyed to her subjects. During Elizabeth's reign, public theater grew in prominence, with a rising number of playhouses and performances across London. The construction of venues such as the Theatre, the Curtain, and most famously the Globe helped cement the status of drama as a key part of urban life. These theaters were not just places for entertainment, they were hubs for political, social, and intellectual discourse. Theatergoers flocked to see performances that reflected the concerns, anxieties, and aspirations of the time. They witnessed dramas that, while entertaining, often contained subtle or overt political commentary. The plays presented at these theaters ranged from historical and mythological subjects to allegorical tales that mirrored the political landscape of the age. The relationship between Elizabeth I and the theater was one of both caution and collaboration. On one hand, the Queen understood the theater's power as a public spectacle capable of uniting people and reflecting the grandeur of her reign. Elizabeth herself was an avid patron of the arts, and her court supported many of the leading playwrights of the time, including Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, and William Shakespeare. In fact, the Queen's coronation and subsequent political maneuvering became the subject of various dramatic works that celebrated her rule and portrayed her as a near-mythical figure. These works reinforced her image as a strong, capable monarch who had not only defeated the Spanish Armada, but had also preserved England's Protestant identity in the face of threats from both within and abroad. However, while the Queen recognized the potential of theater as a tool for political propaganda, She also exercised strict control over the messages it conveyed. Theater was, after all, a powerful medium that could influence the masses, and Elizabeth was acutely aware of the dangers that came with it. She knew that the stage could be a platform for subversive ideas and dissent. The most infamous example of this tension between freedom of expression and state control was the issue of censorship. In the Elizabethan period, the licensing of plays and performances was under the control of the government. The Master of the Revels, a government official, was responsible for reviewing and approving scripts before they were allowed to be performed. This system of censorship ensured that any play with potentially seditious, religiously provocative, or politically dangerous content was either altered or prohibited entirely. Elizabeth's reign also saw the rise of allegory in theater as a tool for indirect political commentary. Allegory, where characters, events, and settings symbolize abstract ideas or real-world figures, became an essential vehicle for playwrights to address contemporary issues without directly challenging the status quo. Through allegory, playwrights could subtly critique the monarchy, explore the nature of power, and comment on the social and political issues of the day, while avoiding the censor's watchful eyes. This indirect approach allowed for a level of creative freedom, as playwrights could disguise their messages in metaphorical and symbolic language, making it difficult for authorities to censor or punish them. One of the most notable examples of this use of allegory in Elizabethan drama is Shakespeare's Richard II. The play explores the deposition of King Richard II and the challenges to royal authority. While set in the 14th century, many critics argue that the play served as an allegory for the political tensions in Elizabeth's own court, particularly regarding the question of succession and the stability of the monarchy. Shakespeare's portrayal of Richard as a king who loses his authority and is betrayed by his subjects could have been seen as a veiled critique of Elizabeth's own rule. The portrayal of Richard's deposition was a sensitive topic, as it could easily be interpreted as a commentary on Elizabeth's precarious position as a childless queen, whose succession was uncertain. Despite this, the play was allowed to be performed, though its political implications were likely recognized by the audience and the authorities. In addition to its use of allegory, the theater also functioned as a tool for state surveillance. The Crown maintained a tight grip on public performances, knowing that the theater could serve as a space for both celebration and subversion. Spies and informants were often planted in the audience to ensure that no seditious ideas were being spread. The plays that were performed were carefully monitored, and any work that challenged the monarch's authority was subject to immediate intervention. This atmosphere of surveillance created a culture of caution among playwrights and performers, who were aware that their works could be scrutinized by the state. In many cases, playwrights self-censored or modified their works to avoid drawing the attention of the government. Despite the strict control and censorship, the public theaters of Elizabethan England became powerful spaces for political discourse. They allowed playwrights to explore the boundaries of power, gender, loyalty, and rebellion. Through their works, playwrights such as Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Jonson engaged with the pressing issues of the time, using the stage as a platform to shape public opinion and reflect the cultural anxieties of the age. The theaters became a space where political authority was both celebrated and critiqued, where monarchs were deified and ridiculed, and where the complexities of power and politics were played out for the masses. The cultural power of the theater during Elizabeth's reign was not only a product of the plays themselves, but also of the theaters in which they were performed. The Globe Theatre, one of the most famous of the time, was a central cultural institution. With its open roof, large capacity, and diverse audience, the Globe became a place where the common people could gather to witness performances that addressed both their personal concerns and the broader political landscape. The theater was a meeting point for all levels of society, from the nobility to the common folk. This diversity of audience helped to ensure that the theater was not only a tool for political propaganda, but also a reflection of the collective consciousness of the nation. The evolution of public theater during Elizabeth's reign represents the intersection of cultural expression and political power. While Elizabeth recognized the theater's potential for promoting her image and reinforcing her authority, she also sought to control the content of performances to avoid any threat to her reign. The use of allegory allowed playwrights to address sensitive political issues, while the surveillance of the theater ensured that no subversive messages reached the public. Theaters like the Globe became cultural powerhouses, shaping public discourse and serving as a space for both political propaganda and artistic innovation. Ultimately, The drama of Elizabeth's era, while shaped by state control, also revealed the complex relationship between power, culture, and public life. The court masque was a distinctive form of entertainment in the Elizabethan and early Stuart courts, blending elements of drama, music, and dance into a highly stylized and symbolic performance. It was a form of courtly spectacle that allowed for the seamless integration of these art forms, offering a rich avenue for political commentary, cultural expression, and the celebration of royal authority. While the masque was not exclusive to the Elizabethan period, it flourished during the reigns of Elizabeth I and her successors, serving as a potent tool of power and self-representation. Masques were often performed at royal courts, particularly during festive occasions such as marriages, coronations, and banquets, where they functioned both as entertainment and as a means of communicating royal power and reinforcing political ideologies. At its core, the masque was a fusion of drama, music, and dance, creating a highly choreographed performance that was designed to dazzle and entertain. These spectacles were typically elaborate, with intricate sets, stunning costumes, and complex musical scores, combining to create an immersive experience for the audience. The performances often featured mythological, allegorical, or classical themes, drawing heavily on classical mythology, the idealized figures of gods and goddesses, and the allegories of virtues and vices. The narratives portrayed in the masques were not only entertaining, but were also designed to underscore political messages and reinforce the divine right of kings, the nobility, and the established social order. One of the central functions of Elizabethan masques was their role as power theater. The performance of a masque was not merely an artistic endeavor. It was a carefully constructed spectacle that symbolized and reinforced the power dynamics of the court. Through the masque, the monarch and members of the royal family could convey their authority and political legitimacy. The masque, often involving complex staging and the participation of court nobles, allowed for the display of both royal grandeur and political unity. It was a platform for reinforcing the idea of the monarch as the central figure in the realm, whose rule was divinely sanctioned and whose court was a reflection of the harmony and order that the monarch brought to the kingdom. In many ways, the masque served as a form of political allegory, with its elaborate symbols and metaphors carrying messages about the nature of power, governance, and order. The performances were often centered around the themes of virtue, justice, and harmony, with the ruler portrayed as a godlike figure who embodied these qualities. These allegories were designed to reflect the monarch's political philosophy and personal virtues, showcasing their ability to maintain order, dispense justice, and embody the highest moral ideals. The masque, then, became a medium for reinforcing the ruler's public image, providing a platform for self-promotion and self-mythologizing. In this way, the masque played an important role in consolidating and legitimizing political power, particularly during the reign of Elizabeth I, where the Queen used these performances to reinforce her image as a strong, capable, and almost divine monarch. The gender dynamics of the court masque were also significant. These performances often showcased the idealized roles of men and women within the social and political order. The male participants in the masques were typically portrayed as powerful figures, embodying virtues such as strength, justice, and wisdom. The women, by contrast, were often represented as symbols of beauty, virtue, and grace. The gendered portrayal of participants was not merely a reflection of societal expectations, but also a political commentary on the roles of men and women within the court and the kingdom. Women were often cast in the masques as goddesses, nymphs, or other mythological figures, representing virtues like purity and chastity. These roles reinforced the gendered power dynamics of the time, in which women were expected to embody ideals of beauty, grace, and domesticity, while men were associated with power and leadership. At the same time, the role of noble women in the masques was pivotal. While they were often portrayed in idealized forms as part of the spectacle, noble women also played active roles in the creation and performance of masques. Many masques were written specifically for noble women to perform, and it was not uncommon for women of high rank to take part in the performances themselves. This involvement gave women a rare opportunity to engage in public performance and to display their grace, beauty, and intelligence in front of the court and the monarch. This was especially important at a time when women's roles in public life were typically restricted, and the court masque offered a rare avenue for women to gain visibility and influence. Moreover, the participation of noble women in the masques was often a form of flattery for the monarch, with the queen or king being praised and honored through the performances. The involvement of noble women in masques also had political significance. In many cases, women's performances were not only symbolic of their own grace and beauty, but also of the loyalty and service they owed to the monarch. By taking part in these performances, noble women were able to display their allegiance to the crown and to demonstrate their role as subjects within the social and political hierarchy. These performances could also be a means for women to assert their personal or familial power within the courtly world, as participation in the masque could raise one's social standing and influence. For example, a noblewoman who performed in a masque with the queen could garner attention and favor, thereby increasing her political capital within the court. The masque also had a performative and ritualistic quality, serving as an enactment of idealized virtue and order. The dancing, music, and dramatic action of the masque represented a temporary suspension of the everyday world, transporting the audience to an idealized space where the political and social order could be reaffirmed. In this sense, the masque was a type of ritual that reinforced the power and legitimacy of the monarchy, with its highly stylized and choreographed elements serving as a metaphor for the orderly, divinely sanctioned rule of the monarch. The court masque was much more than just an entertaining spectacle. It was a carefully crafted political tool that played a significant role in the expression and reinforcement of power at the Elizabethan court. Through the fusion of drama, music, and dance, the masque became a platform for political allegory, gender dynamics, and the reinforcement of royal authority. The active involvement of noble women in the masques further added a layer of political and social significance, as these performances allowed for the expression of loyalty, virtue, and power. In this way, the masque was an essential part of the cultural and political life of the Elizabethan court, providing a rich avenue for the celebration and reinforcement of the power structures of the time. Music played an integral role in the cultural and political life of Elizabethan England, with Queen Elizabeth I herself possessing a notable affinity for music. Her reign, which lasted for over 40 years, saw music evolve from a courtly pursuit to a more public and secular art form. The Queen's musical education and tastes, as well as her patronage of musicians, played a crucial part in the flourishing of music during this period, influencing both sacred and secular compositions, while reinforcing her image as a ruler who supported the arts as part of her sovereign duty. Elizabeth's musical training began in her early years, and her deep appreciation for music became apparent as she matured. Raised in a highly cultured environment, the Queen was exposed to a wide array of musical styles, both sacred and secular. She was said to have had an excellent ear for music, and it is likely that she received formal instruction in singing and playing musical instruments, including the virginals, a keyboard instrument similar to the harpsichord. This early exposure to music influenced her later taste in compositions, as she surrounded herself with talented musicians at her court. Her ability to appreciate and understand music not only elevated the court culture, but also helped foster an environment where music could be used as a tool for political and personal expression. Elizabeth's love of music, combined with her sharp intellect and strong political acumen, enabled her to harness the power of music in ways that would shape English culture for generations to come. As a patron of the arts, Elizabeth I played a significant role in supporting English composers, with her patronage extending to some of the most notable musicians of the period. Among them were William Byrd and Thomas Tallis, both of whom were leading figures in English Renaissance music. Elizabeth's support for these composers helped ensure that England had a distinctive musical identity during her reign. Byrd and Tallis, in particular, were renowned for their sacred music, with Byrd composing some of the most exquisite works of the Elizabethan period, such as his Latin motets and masses. Tallis, likewise, was a composer of great importance, known for his choral works and contributions to the Anglican liturgy. Both composers, although devout Catholics, flourished under Elizabeth's Protestant reign, thanks to her religious tolerance for those who were loyal to her monarchy. Elizabeth's patronage of these composers was not merely an act of personal enjoyment. It also reflected her desire to strengthen the cultural identity of England. By supporting English composers, the Queen ensured that the musical traditions of her kingdom were not only maintained, but also elevated to an international level. This was an important aspect of her reign, as England was emerging as a global power, and the Queen's role in promoting music helped establish England as a cultural force in its own right, independent of foreign influences. The development of the English madrigal during Elizabeth's reign also played a pivotal role in the evolution of secular music. The madrigal, a form of vocal music that flourished in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, was characterized by intricate counterpoint and expressive texts. It was one of the most popular genres of secular music in Elizabethan England and was often composed for small groups of singers, making it a fitting choice for performance in intimate court settings. The madrigal's poetic themes often reflected the courtly love tradition, and its intricate melodies and harmonies appealed to the sensibilities of the English court. The Queen's support for composers of madrigals and secular music contributed to the thriving of this genre, and English madrigalists such as Thomas Morley, John Wilbye, and William Byrd helped shape the development of the form. Their madrigals, which blended the traditional Italian style with English sensibilities, were celebrated for their emotional depth and sophisticated composition. Elizabeth's influence extended beyond the church and court. Secular music, including dance music and instrumental compositions, also flourished under her reign. Music in public celebrations and court ceremonies was integral to the pomp and grandeur of royal events, with composers often tailoring their works to celebrate Elizabeth's power and magnificence. Music played a vital role in the celebratory rituals of the court, especially during grand occasions such as royal birthdays, state banquets, and the annual royal progresses. The Queen was frequently depicted as the subject of musical compositions, and her association with music became part of the political narrative that supported her divine right to rule. Through the use of music in public ceremonies, Elizabeth was able to shape the way her subjects viewed her, presenting herself as a cultured, benevolent, and divine monarch. Similarly, dance played a vital role in the visual and symbolic representation of power at the Elizabethan court. The Queen herself, along with her courtiers, participated in elaborate dances during court festivities, with dance becoming an essential part of courtly life and ceremonial events. Dance, in many respects, served as a metaphor for power, discipline, and social order. The highly structured and choreographed nature of Elizabethan dance reflected the monarchy's insistence on control, hierarchy, and balance within the realm. Dance was also a means by which the nobility could demonstrate their grace, elegance, and loyalty to the Queen. The Queen's participation in these rituals reinforced her status as a ruler who embodied both elegance and control, while also showcasing her ability to participate in the highly ritualized behavior of the court. The choreographed nature of Elizabethan dance made it a particularly useful tool for reinforcing the politics of gender, social roles, and power dynamics. The Queen's own involvement in dancing rituals reflected the political power and the disciplined control that she exercised over her court and her kingdom. Women's roles in these dances were gendered, with women often performing the more graceful, ornamental dances that emphasized their beauty, elegance, and modesty. Men, by contrast, took part in more dynamic and physically challenging dances that highlighted their strength and virility. These gendered distinctions reinforced traditional gender roles, with the Queen herself playing a symbolic role as both a woman and a ruler, embodying the ideal of femininity while simultaneously commanding the respect and loyalty of her subjects. Moreover, dance at the Elizabethan court was a highly visual form of expression, often serving as a type of political theater. The movements and gestures of the dancers were carefully orchestrated to convey messages about the social order, with the Queen at the center of this symbolic choreography. The dances performed during court events often depicted allegories of the monarchy, reinforcing the Queen's image as the source of order, harmony, and balance in the realm. These performances were not only entertainment, they were carefully constructed rituals that reflected and reinforced the political ideologies of the time. Through these public dances, Elizabeth projected an image of herself as a ruler in control of her court and her kingdom, and she employed dance as a metaphor for the stability and control she exerted over the realm. In sum, both music and dance played critical roles in the political and cultural life of Elizabethan England, with Queen Elizabeth I using them as powerful tools of political expression and royal self-presentation. Her patronage of composers and her own involvement in musical and dance performances contributed to the flourishing of the arts during her reign. Music served as a means of reinforcing her political image, while dance provided a visual representation of power and control. The Queen's engagement with both art forms helped shape the cultural identity of her court, solidifying her place as one of the most culturally significant monarchs in English history. Portraiture under Queen Elizabeth I played a fundamental role in projecting her image to the public, not only as a monarch, but also as a symbol of power, eternal youth, and divine rule. During her reign, Portraiture became a highly refined and essential medium through which Elizabeth's image was manipulated and disseminated to reinforce her political authority. The Queen, aware of the power of visual representation, utilized portraiture to present herself as a monarch who was not only ruling in the present, but was also timeless, capable of transcending the natural course of age and mortality. In this way, Elizabeth used art as a tool of self-presentation, demonstrating both her political acumen and the careful curation of her image. The language of portraiture under Elizabeth was one of deliberate symbolism, with each detail meticulously chosen to convey messages of strength, stability, and divine favor. Portraits were crafted not only as likenesses of the Queen, but as political statements that reinforced her authority and public persona. The portraits were often commissioned for display at court, in public spaces, or for distribution across the country to ensure that her image was widely seen. They were often designed to project an image of Elizabeth as an eternal and ageless monarch, never allowing her aging appearance to detract from her role as the ruler of England. The iconography in these portraits was filled with symbolism that spoke to her authority, piety, and the strength of her reign. One of the most iconic portraits of Elizabeth is the Darnley portrait, named after the Earl of Darnley, which was created around 1575. This portrait, widely recognized for its lavish detail, presents Elizabeth as a young and radiant queen, dressed in a sumptuous gown with a highly elaborate ruff. The Darnley portrait is often interpreted as a declaration of Elizabeth's power and eternal youth. The bright, elaborate colors of her gown symbolize the wealth and power of her reign, while the deliberate stylization of her features communicates her idealized, almost otherworldly beauty. By focusing on her youthful and vibrant appearance, this portrait emphasizes Elizabeth's status as a queen who, despite her age, could maintain her allure and the strength that came with her reign. The fact that she remained forever youthful was an important aspect of her political identity. It projected an image of vitality and unchanging power, emphasizing that her rule was not subject to the frailties of aging or time. Similarly, the Armada portrait, painted around 1588, serves as another striking example of Elizabeth's strategic use of portraiture. The painting was created shortly after the defeat of the Spanish Armada, a victory that secured her position as a powerful and invincible ruler in the eyes of both her subjects and foreign nations. In this portrait, Elizabeth is depicted standing confidently, with the Spanish fleet in the background, symbolizing her victory over Spain. The Queen is presented as both regal and divine, draped in rich fabrics, with her hand resting on a globe, a subtle reference to England's growing influence in the world. Her crown and the presence of the fleet symbolize her sovereignty, and her calm, composed demeanor suggests that she is in full control of her kingdom. Elizabeth's facial expression in this portrait exudes calm authority, reinforcing her role as a strong, unyielding leader. The image, however, is not just a record of an event, but a carefully constructed propaganda piece designed to immortalize her victory, and in turn, solidify her claim to divine right and her stature as a ruler of exceptional ability. The Rainbow portrait, painted around 1600, presents Elizabeth as the embodiment of England itself, her image radiant and untouchable, further enhancing her self-representation as a monarch of eternal youth. This late portrait is notable for its use of symbolism, particularly in the rainbow, which serves as a visual metaphor for the peace and prosperity Elizabeth brought to her nation. The Queen's appearance is idealized, as she is depicted wearing a gown that reflects the colors of the rainbow, suggesting that she was the cause of England's greatness. The pearls and jewels that adorn her symbolize purity and wisdom, while the open hand she extends invites the viewer to embrace her image and, by extension, her rule. The portrait's iconic symbolism plays on the belief that Elizabeth's reign was a golden age, and that, like the rainbow, she was a divine figure, sent by God to restore and protect her people. In these portraits, Elizabeth used the art of portraiture to manipulate the viewer's perception of her rule and power. The visual language employed was not a mere representation of a person. It was an elaborate means of political communication. Portraits like these were designed to influence public opinion, shape Elizabeth's legacy, and establish her as a leader who transcended the limitations of time and space. Each element in the portraits was calculated to convey messages of divine favor, unyielding authority, and political stability, ensuring that her image would be embedded in the consciousness of both the English people and foreign powers. In addition to portraiture, Elizabethan England also saw a growing focus on fashion, textiles, and the material culture of the court as essential tools of royal self-presentation. Elizabeth was highly conscious of her appearance, and her clothing, like her portraits, was an extension of her political authority and personal power. Fashion during this period was deeply intertwined with both personal and political expression. The Queen's wardrobe was an elaborate spectacle designed to project her royal status and the power she wielded. Her clothing was not just for personal adornment, it was a visual representation of the monarchy itself. Sumptuary laws, which were enacted to regulate and control what individuals could wear based on their social rank, played an essential role in reinforcing the political and social hierarchy of Elizabethan society. These laws restricted the use of certain materials such as velvet, silk, and fur, and limited the colors and types of clothing worn by different social classes. The Queen, however, was above these laws, and her wardrobe was an extravagant display of wealth and power. By wearing garments made from luxurious materials, adorned with precious jewels and embroidery, Elizabeth signaled her sovereignty and the supremacy of her royal status. The fashion of the court was also a reflection of Elizabeth's political messages. Her clothing was not simply an aesthetic choice, but a powerful symbol of her authority, representing her ability to command and control. Embroidery, a key aspect of Elizabethan fashion, also played an important role in the material culture of the period. Women of the court were responsible for much of the embroidery that adorned the garments of the Queen and her courtiers. The art of embroidery was not only a form of personal expression, but also a method of artistic labor that had political significance. The intricate designs of embroidered garments were often laden with symbolism, representing virtues such as loyalty, strength, and purity. Women's embroidery in the Elizabethan court was not only a decorative art, but a form of cultural production that contributed to the propagation of the Queen's image and the ideals of her reign. The skill and labor invested in creating these textiles became a key component of the royal spectacle, with the Queen herself being the ultimate recipient of this artistic output. Elizabeth's wardrobe also served as a form of theatrical performance. Her carefully crafted public persona was reinforced through the deliberate choices of clothing that she wore to court and on public occasions. Each garment, each jewel, and each embroidery detail were chosen to evoke specific qualities that she wished to project to her subjects. The clothes she wore were not just for her personal comfort. They were part of a broader spectacle designed to evoke reverence and awe. By wearing clothing that was both sumptuous and highly symbolic, Elizabeth projected an image of royal dignity, power, and control. Both portraiture and fashion played key roles in the political and cultural life of Elizabethan England. Through the strategic use of visual art, Elizabeth was able to control her image and ensure that her reign was remembered as one of strength, divine favor, and stability. Her portraits conveyed messages of eternal youth, political power, and national pride, while her clothing and the material culture of the court underscored her royal status and the symbolism of her rule. Elizabeth's ability to manipulate art, fashion, and material culture was a critical tool in her political and personal self-representation, and it helped solidify her place as one of the most iconic monarchs in English history. During the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, architecture played a crucial role in projecting power and cultivating the image of the monarchy. The design of buildings and spaces was not only an aesthetic pursuit, but also a strategic tool for asserting political authority, reinforcing royal symbolism, and creating a visible and lasting impression of the monarch's power. As the Queen navigated the complex political landscape of her time, she and her court made use of architectural designs that spoke to the greatness of her reign, conveyed a sense of stability, and demonstrated her cultural influence both within England and abroad. One of the key aspects of Elizabethan architecture was the use of buildings as instruments of cultural diplomacy, especially through the progrès system, a form of royal progress that saw the Queen travel throughout her kingdom to visit her nobles, inspect her territories, and reinforce her presence in different parts of the country. These travels, which often occurred during the warmer months, allowed the Queen to cultivate loyalty among her subjects and to maintain a visible and commanding presence. The progrès system was not just a political tour. It was also a form of cultural diplomacy that reinforced the power and influence of the monarchy by integrating the Queen into the fabric of English society, where she could display her authority and inspire devotion. The places she visited and stayed during these tours were carefully selected to reflect her status as the head of the state and the symbol of English unity and strength. Elizabeth's visits were often marked by elaborate displays of hospitality and opulence, where the architecture of the spaces in which she stayed played a crucial role in reflecting her authority. For instance, stately homes such as Kenilworth Castle were transformed into venues of political and cultural expression. Kenilworth Castle, located in the Midlands, became one of the most significant sites during Elizabeth's royal progresses. The castle, which had originally been built in the 12th century, was dramatically renovated and expanded by Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, to impress the Queen during her visit in 1575. The transformation of Kenilworth was emblematic of the ways in which architecture was used to serve the interests of the monarchy. Dudley's renovations were designed not only to provide luxurious accommodations for the Queen, but also to serve as a stage for a display of courtly magnificence. The castle's gardens, which were laid out in a grand, formal style, and its newly constructed buildings, including a specially built theatre, were intended to symbolize Dudley's loyalty to the crown, as well as his own political ambitions. Kenilworth Castle thus became more than just a residence. It was a symbol of royal power and an instrument for political messaging. Dudley's investment in the renovation of the castle was a way to use architecture as a form of patronage, with the hopes of securing royal favor and furthering his influence at court. The lavish setting also played an important role in conveying the power of the monarchy to the Queen, her court, and any foreign dignitaries who might have been present during her visit. The architecture of the castle was not merely a backdrop for royal activity, but a tangible representation of the strength, wealth, and cultural sophistication of Elizabethan England. Throughout her reign, Elizabeth's patronage extended beyond the royal progresses and included the commissioning of architectural works, sculptures, and gardens that symbolized the enduring power of the monarchy. The Queen understood the significance of using architecture as a tool for political messaging, and her reign saw the emergence of distinct Elizabethan architectural styles that would influence English design for centuries to come. This period was marked by the construction of grand homes and public buildings that conveyed an image of national pride and stability. Symbolism played a critical role in Elizabethan architecture. Buildings were constructed not only for their practical function, but also for their symbolic importance. The designs of many homes, castles, and palaces reflected themes of power, divine right, and the strength of the monarchy. For instance, Elizabethan homes were often designed with a sense of verticality, emphasizing the power of the monarchy by using tall, imposing structures that suggested both earthly and divine authority. Ornamentation, such as intricate carvings, statues, and coats of arms, was a key feature of Elizabethan design, as it conveyed the monarchy's connection to the divine, the state, and the nation. Architectural symbolism during this period also drew on classical motifs and Renaissance ideals. The use of columns, arches, and symmetry in building designs reflected the growing influence of the Italian Renaissance, which was viewed as a model of both artistic and intellectual achievement. Elizabethan architects were keen to incorporate elements of classical antiquity into their work, as this style represented a link to the ancient Roman Empire and its association with power, reason, and governance. The incorporation of these classical elements in English architecture was intended to position Elizabeth I as a ruler in the tradition of the great monarchs of antiquity, projecting an image of timeless authority and strength. Patronage of architects and sculptors also played an important role in shaping the architectural landscape of Elizabethan England. As the Queen's reign progressed, the court became a significant patron of the arts, supporting artists, architects, and sculptors who could contribute to the grand vision of the monarchy. One of the most notable figures in this regard was the architect Robert Smythson, whose works during the Elizabethan period helped define the distinctive style of English country houses. Smythson was responsible for the design of several notable buildings, including Hardwicke Hall, which became an iconic example of Elizabethan architecture. Hardwicke Hall's dramatic, towering presence and intricate detailing embodied the wealth and power of the aristocracy and the crown, reflecting the social and political aspirations of its owners and the monarchy. Sculptors, too, were commissioned to create works that glorified the Queen and the royal family. Statues and busts of Elizabeth were common in both public and private spaces, reinforcing her divine right to rule and her position as the embodiment of the nation. These works of art were intended not only to memorialize the Queen, but also to inspire a sense of reverence and loyalty among the public. They served as visible reminders of her authority, and their presence in palaces, gardens, and public squares was a way to ingrain the image of Elizabeth in the consciousness of the English people. In sum, the architectural landscape of Elizabethan England was a reflection of the power dynamics of the period, with buildings and spaces acting as instruments for political communication and cultural diplomacy. The Progrès system allowed the Queen to maintain her authority across the kingdom, and the architecture of the homes and castles she visited became symbols of royal power and loyalty. At the same time, the growing influence of classical ideals in architectural design helped to position Elizabeth I as a ruler in the tradition of great monarchs, while her patronage of architects and sculptors further solidified the monarchy's association with cultural sophistication and national pride. Architecture, sculpture, and the visual arts were thus integral to the Queen's ability to project power, maintain political influence, and create a lasting legacy that would endure long after her reign. Queen Elizabeth I's reign not only defined the cultural, political, and religious fabric of England in the late 16th century, but also set the stage for her image and myth to evolve after her death, influencing subsequent generations of artists, writers, political figures, and even feminists. The posthumous legacy of Elizabeth I is a fascinating journey into the ways in which her reign and persona became a touchstone for both national identity and gender politics, shaping not only England's cultural narrative, but also contributing significantly to the development of English nationalism, the image of female monarchs, and the national understanding of English greatness. This legacy continued to be reinterpreted through literature, art, and politics long after her death, cementing Elizabeth's place in history as both an iconic ruler and a symbol of the strength and unity of England. Following her death in 1603, the myth of Elizabeth began to take shape in a variety of forms. Literature and art began to celebrate her as a near-mythical figure, embodying the ideals of wisdom, courage, and femininity. Elizabeth became a symbol of the ideal monarch, an image of strength and piety, and was immortalized in a way that transcended her earthly reign. Her depiction as the Virgin Queen, selfless and devoted to her country, was reflected in numerous posthumous writings, paintings, and sculptures. These works often magnified her virtues and her role in securing the nation's future, depicting her as a monarch who put the welfare of England before her own desires, epitomizing the classical virtues of the wise ruler. Her reign was seen as one of stability, triumph, and prosperity, a period in which England emerged victorious over foreign threats, especially in the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. This image of Elizabeth as a hero, both politically and militarily, was a key aspect of the literature and art created after her death. The Victorian era, particularly in the 19th century, saw a revival of Elizabeth's image, albeit one that was shaped by the political, cultural, and social currents of that time. In Victorian Britain, Elizabeth I became a central figure of national pride and was often idealized as a paragon of virtue and national identity. The Queen's reign, which had been viewed through the lens of the Elizabethan Golden Age during her time, was now portrayed as a key moment in the creation of modern Britain, the foundation of British imperial strength, and the establishment of a unified nation. The Victorian cult of Elizabeth emerged, reflecting a romanticized view of her reign, with a particular emphasis on her role in leading England through times of great challenge. This nostalgia for the Golden Age was also a response to the political and social changes of the time, as the British Empire expanded and Britain found itself at the center of global politics. Elizabeth's reign became a model for the Victorians, particularly in their admiration of her leadership as a female monarch in a male-dominated world. The figure of Elizabeth was held up as a symbol of female power, representing a monarch who had ruled successfully without the need for a husband or male co-regent, which stood in stark contrast to the constraints placed upon women during the Victorian era. As the first truly powerful female monarch in English history, Elizabeth was not only revered for her political accomplishments, but was also considered a symbol of idealized womanhood, embodying qualities of chastity, wisdom, and piety. This posthumous admiration for Elizabeth during the Victorian period significantly contributed to the rise of a distinct, English-centered nationalism, intertwined with the notion of the Queen's legacy. Alongside this fascination with Elizabeth, the myth of the Golden Age. The period during her reign, characterized by relative political stability, flourishing arts, exploration, and military success, became an essential element of British national identity. The idea of a utopian past under Elizabeth was carefully cultivated, providing a sharp contrast to the social and political challenges that the Victorians were facing, such as the effects of the Industrial Revolution and the complexities of empire. Elizabeth's image in the Victorian era became a source of nostalgic pride, and her reign was idealized as the pinnacle of English achievement, an era in which England had secured its place as a leading global power. This nostalgia and idealization of the Elizabethan period, combined with the growing sense of national pride in Victorian Britain, laid the groundwork for a heightened sense of English nationalism that celebrated both the monarchy and the cultural legacy of Elizabeth I. Moreover, Elizabeth I's influence extended far beyond the realms of national pride and the political sphere. Her role as a female monarch who had successfully navigated the intricacies of a patriarchal society had profound implications for gender and power dynamics in subsequent generations. Elizabeth became a symbol for women's empowerment, particularly for female sovereigns who sought to emulate her leadership qualities. Her reign, marked by political and military successes, as well as the maintenance of stability and order within the kingdom, made her a model for women in positions of power. For future female monarchs, such as Queen Victoria, Elizabeth's example offered an archetype for ruling in their own right, independent of male interference or co-regency. Elizabeth's ability to command respect, her shrewd political acumen, and her deft handling of international relations became the touchstones of what it meant to be a powerful woman ruler. In addition to influencing royal women, Elizabeth also had a lasting impact on the feminist movement. Her reign was interpreted in later generations as proof that women were capable of holding the highest offices of power, a revolutionary idea at a time when women's roles in society were severely limited. As such, Elizabeth I became a key figure in the feminist imagination, representing the possibility of women assuming authority without being subordinate to men. Writers, philosophers, and political thinkers often pointed to Elizabeth's reign as evidence that women, when given the opportunity, could lead effectively, and this inspired later generations of women who sought to assert their own rights and claim space in the public and political spheres. The enduring influence of Elizabeth I also played a significant role in shaping England's sense of national identity. Her reign was foundational in consolidating the English state and forging a unified national culture. Elizabeth's success in navigating the complex religious, political, and social landscape of her time helped establish a sense of Englishness that transcended regional differences, bringing together the disparate kingdoms of England, Wales, and Ireland under one crown. Her leadership also played a pivotal role in strengthening the Protestant Reformation in England, marking the break from Catholicism and defining the nation's religious identity for centuries to come. Under Elizabeth's rule, the English language, literature, and music flourished, and they became unifying forces that helped solidify the nation's identity. Writers like William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and Edmund Spenser used their work to both celebrate and critique the ideas of nationalism and religious unity that Elizabeth had come to embody. English literature and the arts became an integral part of the cultural fabric that defined the nation and its citizens. The Queen's support for the arts helped to nurture and promote the development of English literature as a vehicle for national expression and pride. The rise of nationalistic sentiments, combined with the unification of the English language and the establishment of Protestantism, marked a new chapter in the country's history, one that could be understood through the lens of Elizabethan ideology. Elizabeth's canonization as the Mother of the Nation played an essential role in this process. She became the symbol of England's national identity, an enduring figure whose legacy was celebrated in literature, art, and political thought. As the Virgin Queen, she was seen not only as a political leader but also as the embodiment of England itself, a maternal figure who had protected and nurtured her people through periods of turmoil and uncertainty. This image of Elizabeth as the nurturing mother of the nation provided the foundation for later generations to build upon and would help shape English national identity for centuries after her death. Elizabeth I's image in posthumous literature, art, and political thought created a powerful myth that transcended her reign. The Victorian cult of Elizabeth, the nostalgia for the Golden Age, and the influence of her reign on women and national identity helped to shape her lasting legacy as a figure who transcended time, becoming both a symbol of national pride and an inspiration for women seeking empowerment. Her influence, while rooted in her actual achievements, also speaks to the ways in which the myths surrounding her reign shaped and continue to shape English culture, identity, and politics. The afterlife of Elizabeth's image is a testament to her lasting impact on the world and her place in the pantheon of historical figures who defined the course of nations. Queen Elizabeth I's image and legacy have left a profound mark on both art and culture, with her representation as a female monarch shaping artistic depictions of women for centuries to come. Through her reign, Elizabeth became an iconic symbol not only of political strength and independence, but also of the feminine ideal. Her persona, crafted through her own calculated use of visual iconography and symbolic representations, was transformed into an emblematic figure that defined female power, virtue, and the monarchic ideal. This chapter delves into how Elizabeth I's influence in art extended beyond her own time, shaping both the way women were represented in later centuries and how her own image was reinterpreted and appropriated by subsequent generations. At the heart of Elizabeth's image was the deliberate crafting of her monarchic identity, which was communicated through a variety of artistic forms: paintings, sculptures, portraits, pageants, and even literature. Elizabeth, keenly aware of her public image, understood the power of visual representation. Her portraits, in particular, became crucial tools for conveying her authority and reinforcing her role as the ruler of England. These portraits were carefully constructed to highlight her beauty, virginity, and wisdom, and they presented a constructed image of a monarch who was simultaneously both a woman and a powerful political figure. The famous Armada portrait, for example, depicts Elizabeth with the crown of England and a ship in the background, symbolizing her victory over the Spanish Armada. Her attire, the majestic pearls she wore, and the positioning of her hands all carried symbolic weight, communicating her power, purity, and the divine legitimacy of her rule. Her use of iconography in art, often referencing classical goddesses or the Virgin Mary, elevated her to an almost divine status, allowing her to navigate the tricky waters of ruling as a woman in a male-dominated world. Elizabeth's ability to shape her own monarchic identity through art was not just about self-promotion. It was also about projecting power and authority. The feminine ideal she presented through her image went hand in hand with the ideals of the Virgin Queen, symbolizing purity, independence, and the nurturing force of the nation. Her refusal to marry, or take a male consort, was itself an important part of her self-presentation, reinforcing her image as a self-sufficient ruler, one who could be both mother and father to the nation. Elizabeth's personal decision not to marry was transmuted into an artistic and cultural message of women's strength, suggesting that a woman could, indeed, rule in her own right and on her own terms. The lasting impact of Elizabeth's image on representations of women in later centuries cannot be overstated. In many ways, she set the standard for how powerful women were depicted in art and culture. In an era when women were often seen as secondary to men in the political sphere, Elizabeth's carefully cultivated image served as a precedent for other female rulers and figures of authority. Later monarchs, particularly female rulers such as Queen Victoria, emulated aspects of Elizabeth's portrayal, appropriating her image as the strong, self-reliant woman. The ways in which they presented themselves in public through portraiture and iconography reflected the influence of Elizabeth, who was often regarded as the paragon of the female sovereign. Moreover, Elizabeth's legacy continued to shape cultural and artistic representations of women beyond just monarchs in subsequent centuries. During the Victorian period, for instance, the image of the Virgin Queen was revived, embodying the ideal of feminine strength, dignity, and independence. Elizabeth became a symbol not only of political power, but also of the idealized woman, virginal, pious, and eternally youthful. This idea of the ideal woman was deeply embedded in the 19th century imagination and was frequently used in both art and literature to represent feminine virtue and resilience. The Victorians, fascinated by Elizabeth's legacy, infused their art with symbolic representations of the Queen's purity and fortitude, using her image as a model for other representations of women. Cultural memory played a significant role in the way Elizabeth's image was appropriated and reinterpreted over time. As generations passed, her image evolved, yet the essence of her powerful, independent persona endured. In the early 20th century, feminist movements began to engage more deeply with Elizabeth's legacy, re-examining her image not only as a monarch, but as a symbol of female empowerment. For feminist thinkers, Elizabeth represented the possibility of women in positions of power, and her image was frequently invoked as an emblem of the achievements of women in political and cultural history. Her intellectual prowess, rhetorical brilliance, and political savvy made her a role model for women striving to achieve greater autonomy in both the public and private spheres. In this sense, Elizabeth's image as a queen was appropriated and reframed by future generations as a beacon of feminist possibility, transforming her from a royal figurehead into a model of female agency. In addition to her influence on feminist movements, Elizabeth's image also found its way into popular culture, becoming an enduring symbol in literature, theater, and film. The way Elizabeth was depicted in later artistic works reflected both her status as a historical figure and her role as an icon of female power. In literature, authors often turn to Elizabeth as a muse, drawing inspiration from her life and legacy to create fictionalized portrayals of powerful women. In the theater, Elizabeth's portrayal was often used as a framework to explore themes of leadership, duty, and sacrifice. Artists, playwrights, and filmmakers also saw in Elizabeth a model for how women could exercise power and influence in ways that transcended traditional gender roles. Her image, though rooted in history, became a fluid and adaptable symbol that allowed artists to explore and challenge the boundaries of femininity, power, and authority. The representation of Elizabeth I also influenced the broader concept of artistic patronage. As a monarch, Elizabeth was instrumental in promoting the arts, and her influence as a patron shaped the way women were depicted in art for years after her reign. Her commitment to the arts, particularly in terms of supporting English drama and literature, laid the groundwork for the flourishing of the Elizabethan theater. This flourishing of the arts in her time provided a fertile ground for later generations of female writers and artists to emerge, some of whom were inspired by her example. Her role as both a patron of the arts and a muse influenced the creative process in ways that allowed women to challenge traditional depictions of femininity in art and literature. Furthermore, Elizabeth's legacy continued to inform the ways in which women were portrayed in the visual arts, particularly in terms of royal and noble representations. The tradition of commissioning portraits of powerful women, in particular, owes much to the artistic standards set during Elizabeth's reign. Female monarchs who followed in her footsteps, such as Queen Victoria, frequently employed artists to craft portraits that would solidify their authority and present them as embodiments of national strength. The visual representation of women in power became closely tied to the legacy of Elizabeth's iconography, as later rulers and figures of authority adopted similar stylistic conventions in their own depictions. Elizabeth's influence as both a ruler and a symbol transcended her time, impacting not just those who lived under her reign, but also those who followed. The feminine ideal that Elizabeth came to represent, with all its complexities and contradictions, shaped how women were perceived and depicted in art for generations. From the visual representation of female rulers to the emergence of female writers and artists, Elizabeth's artistic legacy helped to define the contours of femininity and power in Western art. She was, and continues to be, both a muse and a model, a figure whose influence on representations of women is immeasurable. Queen Elizabeth I, known for her steadfast leadership and unparalleled political acumen, was not just a sovereign. She was a powerful figure who shaped the cultural and artistic landscape of her time. Her reign, which lasted from 1558 to 1603, saw the flourishing of English arts, marked by an explosion in literature, music, theater, and visual culture. Elizabeth I's multifaceted role as a monarch, patron, and muse left a profound legacy that continued to influence the arts long after her death. Her reign was not only a golden age of English culture, but also a defining moment in the history of women in power, where gender, politics, and creativity intertwined in ways that continue to resonate today. At the core of Elizabeth's influence on English culture was her unique ability to blend political power with artistic patronage. As a ruler, she understood the power of the arts to shape public perception, assert her sovereignty, and legitimize her reign. Elizabeth was more than a political leader. She was an active participant in the creation of a national identity, using the arts as a tool of diplomacy, propaganda, and cultural unification. Her involvement in the arts went beyond simple patronage. She was a cultural architect, shaping the intellectual and artistic environment of the court, influencing the development of national culture, and guiding the direction of English literature and visual arts. The long-term impact of Elizabeth I on literature, music, theater, and visual culture is undeniable. One of the most enduring aspects of her legacy is the explosion of English drama, most notably through the works of William Shakespeare and his contemporaries. Elizabeth's reign coincided with the rise of the English theatre, and her support of playwrights and the development of public theatres, such as the Globe, transformed the landscape of literature. Shakespeare's plays, many of which contain subtle allusions to Elizabeth's reign, were not only vehicles of entertainment, but also a means of political commentary and cultural expression. Elizabeth's reign provided the fertile ground in which the theatre could flourish, and through her patronage, the Elizabethan stage became a dynamic force for national identity and creative expression. In addition to theatre, Elizabeth's influence extended deeply into music, with composers such as William Byrd and Thomas Tallis benefiting from royal patronage. The Queen's musical tastes were refined, and she herself was a skilled musician, often playing the virginal and composing music. Elizabeth's support of the arts helped solidify the position of music within the royal court and society. Under her rule, the English madrigal, a form of secular vocal music, gained prominence, and the sounds of the Elizabethan court echoed through the halls with an unprecedented harmony. Her involvement in the development of music contributed to the cultural richness of the period, establishing a lasting legacy for English music. Moreover, Elizabeth's impact on visual culture, particularly through her use of portraiture and royal iconography, is a defining feature of her reign. She mastered the art of self-representation, carefully curating an image of strength, virtue, and political sovereignty. The Armada portrait, in which Elizabeth is depicted as a triumphant and almost divine figure, is one of the most famous examples of her image-making. Through such portraits, Elizabeth became a symbol of both English power and the virginity that was central to her identity as the Virgin Queen. These portraits, imbued with symbolic references to her authority and purity, were not only artistic expressions but also potent political tools, carefully designed to project the Queen's unassailable power and divine right to rule. Elizabeth's cultural patronage extended beyond the visual and performing arts to include architecture, dance, and literature. The court became a hub for the flourishing of various art forms, with courtiers, artists, and musicians contributing to a vibrant cultural environment. The Queen's involvement in the commissioning of works, as well as her engagement with cultural events such as masques, tournaments, and pageants, further strengthened her role as a cultural architect. These performances, blending drama, dance, music, and elaborate costuming, were not only spectacles but also means of political expression, often showcasing the Queen's power and sovereignty in allegorical forms. The intersection of gender, politics, and creativity was central to Elizabeth's reign. As a woman in power, Elizabeth had to navigate the complex dynamics of gender expectations while simultaneously asserting her authority as a ruler. Her refusal to marry and her portrayal as the Virgin Queen were powerful statements that reinforced her independence and political authority. In a world where female rulers were rare and often viewed with suspicion, Elizabeth redefined what it meant to be a woman in power. Through her strategic use of art and cultural production, she reimagined the role of women in leadership, not as passive figures but as active agents shaping the destiny of nations. Elizabeth's legacy is also deeply intertwined with the idea of national identity. She presided over a period of immense social, political, and cultural change in England, and the arts played a key role in forging a collective sense of English identity. The literature, music, and art of the Elizabethan era celebrated the nation's strength, its Protestant identity, and its position as a growing power on the world stage. Elizabeth herself embodied this identity, using her image to create a vision of England as a united, powerful, and culturally sophisticated nation. Her reign laid the foundation for the emergence of English nationalism, which would continue to evolve in the centuries following her death. Furthermore, Elizabeth's influence as a female monarch set a precedent for future generations of women in power. Her reign showed that women could wield political and cultural power as effectively as men, and her example paved the way for future female rulers and leaders. Her impact on female sovereignty is felt not only in the political realm, but also in the cultural and artistic spheres. The Queen's reign demonstrated that women could be both political leaders and patrons of the arts, simultaneously shaping the direction of national culture while asserting their own authority. In the broader context of global history, Elizabeth I's reign holds a unique place. She is regarded not only as a powerful monarch, but also as a cultural icon and a model for women in leadership. Her ability to combine political acumen with artistic patronage made her one of the most formidable rulers of her time, and her influence as a woman in power continues to be felt today. Elizabeth's legacy, both as a monarch and as an artist, has transcended her own era, leaving an indelible mark on history. Queen Elizabeth I's role in shaping the English arts is a testament to her vision, her understanding of the power of culture, and her ability to combine art with politics. Through her reign, she redefined the role of women in power and established a legacy that continues to influence the arts, politics, and the representation of women in positions of authority. Elizabeth's multifaceted impact on literature, music, theater, and visual culture makes her one of the most significant figures in both English history and the history of women in power. As a monarch, artist, muse, and cultural architect, Elizabeth I left an indelible mark on the world, one that continues to inspire and shape our understanding of the relationship between power, gender, and creativity.